Welcome to the first episode of Interview with an Author. I'm Connie Blumhardt, founder and publisher of Roast Magazine. Roast is a bi-monthly trade publication covering the coffee industry from a technical standpoint. We talk about where coffee is grown, how it's roasted, how it's brewed, all from a technical standpoint. The point of this interview is to showcase the amazing writers that contribute to Roast Magazine and the importance of the topics that we feature in the magazine. I'm pleased to have our first guest, Chris Kornman, author of the Green Coffee book and frequent contributor to Roast Magazine. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Connie. Thanks for having me.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I recently turned 40, which is exciting. I live in Oakland, California, and have for about 7 years now, so I guess that makes it home. I have a partner who's opening a comedy theater. She does improv.
Oh, wow.
And together we've raised a black and gray tabby cat named Mr. McGillicuddy and a a fawn coat pit bull mix named Ice Cream.
Nice.
And
I didn't know those things about you. It's cool.
Yeah, that's the stuff that you get to see if you do a deep dive on my Instagram, I guess.
Gotcha. So do you have to try to be funny for your partner, or is she just the comedic one in the relationship?
Yeah, she gets to own the comedy thing. If I try too hard, she lets me know.
All right, how did you get into coffee?
How did I get into coffee? I needed money for books in college, and I took a job at it was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, is where I was going to school. Took a job at a little place called Greyfriars Coffee, which was sort of styled as a Scottish coffee house, except that it was very early third wave American. There was some leather couches, but they poured latte art and they roasted in house. And the owner, Ian Goodman, taught me how to pour latte art, and a lot of the stuff that I think folks like myself were learning in, what was that, 2003, was kind of setting the stage for what would later become kind of a third wave explosion. And Ian, in many ways, was kind of on the cutting edge of that, which was kind of cool. So I worked for him for a couple of years, and then moved to Chicago. And after sort of a failed start to a film career, I fell back on the coffee skills and fell in with Intelligentsia and helped them, as a barista, I helped them open the third cafe in Chicago before they expanded nationwide, and met a bunch of folks that became, lifelong colleagues and comrades, and was just in the right place at the right time with the right skill set for a lot of things. And so I worked in the QC department. I worked as a production roaster. I purchased coffee from Brazil, Rwanda, Tanzania, Burundi, Zambia, and got to travel a whole bunch with them over the course of the decade or so that I spent with them.
Nice.
Yeah, and then I moved to the West Coast and joined Royal Coffee.
That's super cool. Tell us about your current job.
Right, so they call me the Director of Education, which currently means that I'm wearing a ton of hats. I still do sourcing, which is really fun. I'm hoping to return to East Africa to visit my supply partners there this coming spring. And I do a fair amount of QC work. I help to manage the Crown Jewel product line. So just keeping fresh coffees on the menu for roasters and doing a lot of analytics. I am also granted a lot of liberty to do R&D. So a lot of the stuff that I work on behind the scenes eventually ends up on the pages of Roast Magazine when I write about it, which has been a really exciting career evolution for me. I had a background in English in school and hadn't really used it until fairly recently. So that's been an exciting opportunity for me.
Well, it's been amazing for us too. Your contributions to roast in the industry are literally unparalleled. Thank you so much for being part of that.
Thanks, that's very kind.
And contributing to the magazine. So let's talk about the article that we published in the January-February issue of Roast. Additive Fermentation, Infused Coffee is gaining popularity and sparking industry debate. Tell us about the article.
Sure. I felt like it was time for someone to put something in writing about um, some of the things that folks are doing that are very innovative. And, I think that 5 years ago, I would have approached this with a much more skeptical take. But having seen the way that the industry has really exploded, and particularly the kind of like renaissance we're in terms of fermentation technology, it felt like a good time to kind of examine it with a little bit less bias and a little bit more of an open mind. And so I talked to a whole bunch of folks that are doing different types of infused or co-ferments, or just working in untraditional ways with fermentation in coffee, and just kind of like explore the results, explore the edges of like what people think about it, talk to some baristas and roasters about the issue as well. So it was really, it started with a very small spark and became this pretty expansive piece where I talked to a whole bunch of people about it, which was cool to get lots of different perspectives on it.
Right. Do you want to like dive really deep into the article? Like, do you
Yeah,
want
I
to
can.
talk about, yeah, I think so, because I mean, it was one of the most exciting articles that I've read in a while, just because, like you mentioned, it's a hard topic to approach without sparking a lot of debate. And I think you did a really good job of that.
Thanks. Credit to your editorial board as well for helping to guide the piece, because I think the draft that I came at you with was probably a little on the heavy-handed side as well. So achieving a bit more balance was really something that I needed. The article started, I was surfing Instagram and I came across Kat Melheim's page that where she posts a whole bunch of stuff about what she does, day in, day out over at Black and White Coffee Roasters in
I
Durham,
love it, by the way.
which is
I
it's
love
a,
her page.
yeah, it's a great Instagram. She's very
Hmm.
like matter of fact and takes some cool pictures and just has a lot of fun with it. So she posted this relatively innocuous, photo of some coffee beans that had been co-fermented with strawberries, I think, something like that. And by the time I got to the post, there was something like 60 or 70 comments on it. And I was like, wow, people have a lot to say about this. And
Hmm.
so kind of that was this like, well, let's dig into, why is it causing controversy? And also maybe like, let's define our parameters. What are we talking about? So specifically, I went and talked to Marcelo Pereira, who's the spouse of a coworker and who does a bunch of consulting, including on a farm that I've worked with for a very long time now in Tanzania, that's owned by the Vahora family, talking about co-fermenting with citric acid, which I think is not something that a whole lot of people are doing straight acid infusions, at least not in the coffee industry. This is like more like wine technology, where you're kind of like balancing pH and chemistry in a way that we really haven't seen in coffee. And then I talked to Edwin
Yeah.
Norena, who's a coffee farmer in Quindío, Colombia. And this is the first year that I've worked with him, so the relationship was brand new. But Edwin was extremely open to chatting about things and to telling me what he's doing with his insane-sounding coffees. He's got this Galaxy hop infused Gesha and this ahi chili co-fermented Bourbon, and it's just out of this world. And he's using his primary ingredient is what he calls mosto, or must, which is kind of like maybe not the exact right way to describe this, but it's basically the pulpy runoff of a previous fermentation batch, and it's like charged
So
with a whole
crazy.
bunch of bacteria and yeast, and it just like it supercharges the fermentation in
Hmm.
a sort of natural kind of way. And the flavors are out of this world and crazy stuff. And so like getting some perspective on like why he was doing this, he just wanted to like boost flavors that were already present in the coffees that he was working with and growing. And so that was kind of like where I started, was like going to the source, asking people who were open and transparent about what they were doing, like why and what, basically.
Right. Before we go further, will you give me a quick description of your perception of inoculation and co-fermentation?
Yeah, sure.
I think that that's one of the, one of the parameters that when you're looking at it, you have to really start to draw these lines because it gets tricky.
Right. I think it's distant enough from the average coffee roaster or coffee person too that's not growing and processing that maybe it's easy to confuse what's happening. So
Yeah.
when we use the term inoculation, and this is something that I've talked with folks at yeast labs about for a long time. Inoculation is when we use a controlled strain, usually a culture of yeast or bacteria, and we add that to an otherwise unadulterated tank. So fermentation usually takes place with maybe native yeasts and bacteria, whatever's hanging around in the environment. And inoculation basically loads the tank with a predetermined culture to outcompete whatever other organisms might be around. And it helps to control consistency, and you can get a certain degree of control of flavor profile depending. It's very common in, again, the wine industry, for example. As opposed to co-fermentation or infusion, which are less strictly defined and basically means tossing something into the tank that is not a live culture and not the water that we'd normally soak fermenting coffee in. It would be either a fruit or maybe even non-food substance like citric acid. Cinnamon is another common one that we hear folks talking about. And of course, Edwin Norena using chili peppers and galaxy hops. So.
All right, so that sets sort of the tone of what the article is about. And then you kind of go into reactions from the industry, because there are people that are for it, there are people that are against it. Tell us about, I found the part about the barista competition and Cup of Excellence. There are very strict guidelines on no co-fermentation.
Right. So they're kind of two separate sides. And if you think about Cup of Excellence, I spoke to Darren Daniel, who's the director of that program for ACE, and was pretty specific about no co-fermentations being allowed. And I guess kind of like on an operational level, it makes a lot of sense because Cup of Excellence is attempting to celebrate things like transparency and explore price ceilings and really connect in meaningful ways, like differently grown and processed coffees. And for there to be lack of clarity on what the ingredients are can cause potentially, issues with the way that folks connect to each other, whether they're farmers or producers or roasters.
Right.
That being said, there's not currently a category that allows any of those types of coffees in. And so I think we've kind of reached the boundaries of what in some ways Cup of Excellence might be able to sustain if they want to continue growing with the industry. Maybe there's an opportunity to, because they've already run into issues like all of a sudden the naturals took over at Cup of Excellence, even though they're disproportionately represented, right? On the top ends. And things like Gesha, for example, a number of years ago being like the only coffees that would end up in the top 10. And that causes some concern about fairness as well. And but those were all allowed. And so like, what's the arbitrary distinction between co-fermentation? We're still kind of trying to figure that out.
For sure.
Darren in his interview was pretty open with me, but he also expressed a funny sentiment that was like, well, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And I was like, well, yeah, but that's a very rigid approach to a really fluid situation. And so I think that there's still conversation to be had about this.
Yeah, and I feel like, there's just constant movement forward with processing, right? People are always trying to bring out something different in the coffee, whether it's natural or, an additive. But I feel like we're not stopping the train. So probably defining it is, a good idea.
Right. And that kind of leads into, I feel like in a way that leads into the question of whether or not it should be allowed in the barista competition, because we've got a very different set of rules and regulations here. And while it's true that WBC has set as a standard that, well, their phrasing is problematic, first of all, because first they say nothing can be used except for things, except for coffee, which would exclude they specifically mention liquids can't be used, and that would exclude water. So their definitions at the beginning of their regulation phrase are too strict. And then they have a phrase after that that gives an exception. And it says, except things that would be used during processing,
Naturally,
and
right,
that's a very wide open door. And
right.
it's currently interpreted to mean no co-fermentation, but if you look at the exact language that's used, um, the enforcement doesn't match the linguistic choices, in my opinion. But this is causing a lot of
For
like
sure.
fairness questions from baristas about like, well, if a barista knows that their coffee is infused with, say, cinnamon, part of the scoring is based on them being able to identify those flavor profiles in their coffee when they present them to judges. And so there's like, well, if you know it's going to be cinnamon infused, then is that a disadvantage for other folks who aren't using co-ferments? And then there's also the question of like, well, the baristas are adding a whole bunch of flavor on their end,
Right.
signature
I
drinks.
know.
Is
I know.
that an arbitrary distinction?
Yeah,
It's an open question, I guess.
it is. And I think that's one of the reasons why I found the article so interesting. You know, I saw your eyes light up when you talked about chili additive, and because it's exciting, right? Like
It
this
is.
produces new flavor profiles, but then it also creates all these problems for the competitions actually that we have, right? It's really the only, I don't know, I don't see any other problems in it. Um, is there
But there's people
anything,
that people who do, which I think
right,
is
right,
really
oh yeah,
fascinating. There's a whole
right.
subset
I
of
mean,
like, not only should this be barred from competition, we shouldn't be calling these things coffees. And I'm
I
like,
know. Okay, is there anything that you learned from writing the article that didn't make it into the article that you want to share?
um, I really tried as hard as I could, especially when I was talking to producers, to respect things that they felt like they didn't want to share. And for the most part, people were really
Mm,
open, which I thought was impressive. I think that there's sort of a like, we've got nothing to hide, we do this with pride,
mm,
sort of approach to many people. And so it surprised me to learn that there was this like kind of subculture of vigilantism,
mm,
um,
mhm,
that was like really trying to like test and point out people who were being disingenuous, like producers
mm,
specifically who were being disingenuous. And
mm,
I pursued that a little bit as well, and talked with people who had some opinions that I didn't really feel comfortable repeating,
mm,
because they kind of brushed up against. This is also slightly off topic, but I recently listened to a podcast about the Bragg apple cider family and how they sort of conflated
mm,
like body health with like spiritual purity. And I guess I felt like there was a way that some of the people that I spoke to were doing the same thing with like coffee purism.
mm,
And so
mhm.
I, for that
Interesting.
reason, like I learned more than I cared to in some ways.
Got it. Yeah, yeah, I mean, if if coffee is one thing, we are a group of passionate people,
Yeah,
right?
that's true. That's true. And it's something that I respect about people that work in coffee.
Same, right? It's one of the things that we love about it, right?
Uh-huh.
We're in this industry because we love it so much. Last question. How do you hope that the article impacts the industry?
Well, I guess first and foremost, to approach stuff like this with an open mind. I think that when I first heard about things like barrel aging coffees a number of years ago, I was very skeptical. And I think that there's plenty of reasons to approach untested methodology with, you
Hmm.
know, a degree of like, skepticism is probably the wrong word, but care, attention to
Yeah.
detail, and ultimately like respect for everyone in the supply chain on both sides. As a buyer of green coffee, and then as a person who's employed by a very large importing company who sells a lot of coffee to roasters, I have to consider both ends. And so when I'm thinking about coffees that are co-fermented, infused, or otherwise like just non-traditional methods, like being really um, thoughtful in my approach to the way that I speak about the coffees, the way that I speak about the methods, and really just getting a lot of buy-in from both ends of the supply chain. And so I think when roasters, hopefully, if they have read this article, and it will cause them to think a little bit more about what transparency might mean and what our demands for transparency might mean, on the far end of the supply chain, where things might be a little bit less or a little bit more gray, I guess, than what we're used to. And then, something that I repeat fairly frequently is the idea of equitable, co-experimentation. If you as a roaster are like, hey, this is a cool thing that I've seen someone else do, and you take that idea to your supply chain partner, to also have skin in the game, because you're asking them to do something that they may or may not have the appropriate infrastructure for, and you're asking them to either invest monetarily or, if nothing else, invest product that they might otherwise be able to sell. And so having equitable, experimental, approach to that, I think, is really important.
It's very important. And as an industry, we've talked about this for many years. So hopefully it's starting to, become practice. I hope. I know I'm a wishful, hopeful thinker, but you probably see a lot more than I do.
I see a good amount of folks that are really, I think, approaching it right, but it doesn't hurt to bang the drum a few extra times.
Never, never. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time and for writing the article, and especially for just being so thoughtful about our coffee industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. That's really kind.
Until the next time, until the next article.
Yeah,
All right,
exactly.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Connie. Take care.
All right.